Hi, Misha here, and a couple of you have asked me to redo my older video on this critter here, the Eurofighter Typhoon, or F2000. Happy to do it. I'm doing my best and trying to learn little tricks that help me to keep things on. So I figured while doing another video, I might as well get in more into the history and also show you another model in the Typhoon series. This here is the British Typhoon T.3 two-seat trainer, which is also combat capable. And the original one here is the modern Typhoon FGR.4, which is the upgraded version in British service. And this particular one is modeled after those stationed in the Falklands for defense. Both of these are 1/72 scale diecast from Corgi. Typhoons, Eurofighters, are also made by Herpa, Hogan, JC Wings, but a lot of those are 1/200 scale. And next year, Hobby Master is coming out with a couple of Eurofighters too. What's funny is, though, you don't see a whole lot of variation. A lot of companies make this plane, but aside from paint schemes, they don't change it a lot. As for the history of this plane, look, I know in the USA the F-35 Lightning is infamous for its delays and cost overruns and compromises. I don't know. The Eurofighter Typhoon might give it a run for its money and might even be worse. I think in the cost overruns departments it really is. This dates back all the way to the early 70s when the British Royal Air Force, RAF, outlined a need for a new high-performance fighter interceptor. It had recently canceled the F-111 and it was going through a lot of changes. The future of the Jaguar was uncertain. The Tornado wasn't really in swing yet. They did try some domestic attempts to make something, but they just never really got off the drawing board, and they were worried about investing all the money and having to compete with new American planes like the F-15, F-16, and the very new F-18, later to be the F-A-18. Not to mention Dassault and all that. Well, around the same time, West Germany too was looking for a new fighter interceptor to help defend its borders against Russian bombers and other incursions. So around 1979, they kind of formed a partnership. And this would be originally known as the ECF, European Collaborative Fighter. And then late that year, Dassault said they were interested, so they entered into the partnership, making it a three-way, and it became the ECA, European Combat Aircraft. At this time, it started to have more multi-role features, more of a swing role as it's called, including use on naval carriers. But this program did not last long. By 1981, it fell apart. Mostly because British Aerospace and Dassault were arguing over which engine to use, and the governments were arguing kind of who had authority, and also the British had different needs than the French, and Germany was just kind of there. So what came next was the ACA, Agile Combat Aircraft, in 1982. This was more or less a proposal from British Aerospace. I mention it only because this is where the Delta Wing kind of first gets introduced. British Aerospace offered to basically build the prototype, kind of spearhead, but the partners, Germany, and at this point we also have Italy interested, just really weren't in for it, so that kind of gave way to the next year. We get to FIFA, the next little round, the Future European Fighter Aircraft. This was another partnership between France, the UK, West Germany, Italy, Spain. Are you starting to see where there's problems? Again, by 84, arguments ensued. One major sticking point was Dassault wanted to be the prime contractor and have kind of authority and have headquarters based in France. Obviously, the UK and Germany weren't real cool with that. More importantly, maybe though, France was still operating a large aircraft carrier. The UK had already retired all of theirs by this point, and Germany didn't have any. So France wanted to make sure the plane could be carrier operable. No one else needed that. Blada blada. France and Spain pulled out, leaving Britain, Italy, and Germany to reaffirm the project in 1985. Now at this point, even they're all getting tired of all these new acronyms and names. This whole thing had been informally known as the Eurofighter since the early 80s. So, the names are just, I think, written on paper to look good, and you know how governments work. Well, late 85, Spain rejoins, despite French protest. France would not rejoin. Instead, Dassault would move ahead, ultimately developing what we know today as the Rafale, which replaced the Mirage series, but that's a story for another video. So France is out permanently. We have UK, Germany, Italy, and Spain. In 86, they kind of all reconfirm this. And a new company, Eurofighter GmbH, is established in Germany. This is kind of a holding company with assets from various European companies, including British Aerospace, Messerschmitt, and later Airbus. But manufacturing, assembly would be done in each of the member nations. But they would each kind of specialize in a certain component and then ship those components to each nation, and each nation would do their final assembly and testing. So by 86, 87, what they've decided to do. The UK needs 250 planes. Germany needs 250. I should say West Germany, but I think you know what I mean. Italy needs a few less, 165, and Spain needs the smallest number, 100. So still respectable numbers, putting production over 750. To that end, they decided the fair thing to do would be the more planes you bought, the more work share you got, which meant it's good for your economy, the more people employed and all that good stuff. Britain and Germany would each get 33%. Italy would get 21%, and Spain would get 13%. All very nice and fair. So everything went swimmingly from that point, right? We got the name Eurofighter. British Aerospace did make a prototype, not really of this, but kind of a pre-production tech prototype known as the EAP, which rolled out in early 1986 and flew in August of 1986. And actually this prototype would be used for a number of years to test new technologies. And then the name Eurofighter EFA would be adopted by 1988 officially. A little simpler, I suppose. There were some funding issues, but this was overcome. But then 1989 happened. The Berlin Wall fell, and West Germany and East Germany would soon rejoin. And then, of course, between that time and the end of 1991, communism itself would fall throughout Europe and eventually the Soviet Union, which would change everything and probably should have killed the Eurofighter. But it obviously did not. Figured it may be time to switch models out here. Let's put the T.3 on the stand. And by stand, I mean this is actually a cake decorating thing I picked up at a hobby store. But it works. This model actually, even though it is a trainer, it is combat capable. And it comes with a couple of missiles. It comes with a total of 3 ferry tanks, drop tanks, but if you want to put it on the stand, I don't think you can use the middle one, so I have the 2 on. The FGR.4 also came with drop tanks, but I kind of like the clean look. It does have, I don't know if you saw, missiles on the bottom, 4 of them, so it's armed. I don't know, I just didn't put the tanks on. Anywho, yeah, the Eurofighter probably should have just ended with the Cold War. Once East Germany joined West Germany, they were in pretty big financial straits. Shocking, I know, but all those years of communism did not leave East Germany with a fantastic economy. On top of that, defense spending was cut for obvious reasons. The big Soviet menace, literally on their doorstep, was gone. And so they really thought, instead of going with the expensive, convoluted Eurofighter, let's just take some of the tech we've created for it and make a small, lightweight, cheaper, easier to operate alternative. Kind of reminds me of what they ended up doing when they didn't go for the Hecheln Koch G11 and they ended up going for the G36. But first they kind of tried to get out. They butted heads over the radar and some other electronics to be used in 1990. This got smoothed over by some politicking. Then in 1991, Lord Dark Helmet Cole, made promises on the campaign trail that he would basically cut the wasteful, bloated Eurofighter that Germany didn't need. The government would just cut it. I'm sure that sounded great until they realized a few things. One, they were very strongly committed. They had signed contracts. And funnily enough, Germany was one that put a lot of the penalties in for backing out. So it did it to itself. You really can't blame the other nations. On top of that, remember that work share? Germany was really wanting that for its aerospace industry. It did not want to lose the jobs and the money. So they went ahead. But don't worry, progress was made because in 1992, they selected the name F2000. I guess when you can't have real progress, you just, do names. A prototype was being worked on, though, and it finally flew, a prototype actually of the Eurofighter, now named F2000. It finally flew in March of 1994. And it would be the first of 7 to be built. The reason they built so many test planes is so each nation could have a couple to, mess with. And they would actually fly these test planes named or numbered DA1 through 7 for a long time, over a decade in some cases. Just, testing new tech. Why not? Making the most out of their investment. Well, starting in 95, 96, every partner wanted to cut its orders. It originally had placed them a decade earlier during the Cold War. Cold War was over. Understandable. Britain went from 250 down to 232. Italy went from 165 down to 140. Excuse me, I screwed that up. 121. I apologize. Spain went from 100 to 86. And Germany was the biggest decreaser. They went from 250 down to 140. So if they can't get out, they'll just buy nearly half of what they were originally planning on. So, great. Except, remember that work share thing? That threw off the numbers a lot. It left Britain paying, getting nearly 40% of the work because they still had by far the largest order. Of course, Spain didn't really change much. Italy actually jumped ahead quite a bit to the point that it was nearly at the same percentage as Germany. Again, Germany didn't want this. They wanted work share. Yada yada. A compromise was reached where Germany agreed to purchase 180. So they bumped their order up by 40, which bumped their work share up from about 24% to about 29. So, yeah, a little less than 33, but, a lot better. Of course, that bumped Britain down to about 37, and that left Italy between 19 and 20%, and it left Spain around 14-15%. So great, we got all this ironed out, right? Yep, everything's going good. In August, September of 96, the UK confirms, hey, we got the funding, we're ready to go, we're ready to ramp up production. A few months later in November, Spain and Italy come on board, they're ready to go, and everyone's waiting on Germany to call, and they don't. They keep delaying and delaying and delaying. Some arm twisting has to be done. Finally, they sign away some funding and sign up for production in October of 1997. So they dragged their feet for a year, but I guess they hit a point where they just couldn't do it any longer. So production contract was signed. They used the data from the prototypes. We're going to make these things. And amazingly, they did. In 1998, because by this point it's just kind of what they do, September 2nd, a naming ceremony was held in the UK where this plane was christened the Typhoon. I think one of my favorite stories of the whole Eurofighter saga is that Germany didn't like the name Typhoon. They remembered the Hawker Typhoon from World War II. Yeah, get it. And it has to be a little bit of cheek, British sense of humor. They came back with, okay, how about Spitfire 2? I don't think Germany found that funny. I do, though. And so, yeah, what happened in Britain, and for export, this would be known as the Typhoon. It would also be known as the Typhoon in Spain, but for Italy and Germany, it would still be under the F2000 name. Kind of gets into the whole what's in a name, right, guys? But, yeah. So, the first kind of pre-production or regular production models were T1s, so they were two-seat trainers for conversion units, and they first rolled out in 2002 and were test flown later that year. Like I said, pretty much each nation would kind of specialize in making a certain component, and then final assembly would happen in each customer nation. So if any customizations were needed, they could do it. And the first one started to arrive in the various air forces between 2003 and 2004. Now at this point, these are mostly trainers, conversion planes, so on and so forth. And the saga is still far from over. So let us both go grab something to drink, and you can pause it. I'm going to stop it here, and then we'll move forward into the 21st century. By the way, we are now 30 years after this plane idea was initially presented in 71, 72 in Britain. Just thought I'd mention that. Production for the Eurofighter was handled or broken up into what they called tranches. These weren't like marks or upgrades necessarily. They were just kind of orders and whatnot. Although often then, of course, they would correspond as time went on with different blocks. And blocks tended to be what were there for showing improvements or additions or variations. The original contract for Tranche 1 was signed that same time in September of 1998. It was to be just under 150 aircraft, I think 148. Of those, 53 were to go to the RAF, and of course the rest would be split between the other partners. As like I said a minute ago, the first, pre-production or initial production planes, Block 1s, would be rolled out of the factory in 2002. They would be accepted in England in June, July of 2003, and then squadrons would begin working with them, training on them, bug testing them by December of that year. By 2005, conversion would start to work, and by 2006, relatively early on, the first full Typhoon squad would be formed. These would start off actually as two-seaters. The first ones, the Tranche 1 Block 1s that would be received, would be what were called the T1. There would also be a T1 Block 2 with a minor update. But these would, be unarmed, so they could start working, training pilots, and working with the flight characteristics. This would soon be joined by the F2, which was a fighter interceptor, a strictly air-to-air version. The earliest glimmers of any kind of air-to-ground ability would appear with the Block 5, and many of the older planes would be updated to this standard over time as well. Deliveries for Tranche 1 would continue until 2008. In March of that year, the final one would be delivered. It would go to West Germany as it would happen. And also by that year, they were considered fully operational, bug-tested, updated to the newer block, ready to go. Well, zipping back a bit, in December of 2004, the British government signed funding and approval for Tranche 2, which would be around 90 aircraft, most of which would actually go to the UK. It would be around 67 planned to go to the UK. And as soon as Tranche 1 was complete, Tranche 2 production would start up in April of 2008. And they would kind of begin with Block 8 and move through Block 10. This would add more capability as a ground attack, also compatibility with newer things like GPS-guided ordnance. They would have an updated flight mission computer, you know, you get the idea. Typical avionics updates, so on and so forth. And, you know, bug fixes and patches and the like. It's worth noting that by 2011, the UK was celebrating its 100th Typhoon in service. We still have a ways to go. We're only in Tranche 2. Well, talks for Tranche 3 began in 2008. And really through early 2009, Britain was kind of hedging their bets, saying, well, you know, we already have about 120 aircraft either in hand or on order. That might be enough. You know, we've had budget overruns, yada yada. I think everyone's kind of getting tired at this point. No one's really going to kick too much of a fuss. Well, they ended up, it's kind of a lot of talk. They did end up purchasing into Tranche 3. An agreement was signed summer of that year. Originally, Tranche 3 was going to be a big one. It was going to be 236 aircraft. I guess the original thought was, well, we've kind of worked out the bugs. Now it's ready to go into production. I think really what it was is they had been kind of delaying the inevitable and buying as little as they could early on. And I'm just talking about Britain. I'm talking about the other nations. If anything, Britain has the most at this point. Then they had this idea, well, let's break Tranche 3 up into two blocks, A and B, with Block A having 112 aircraft. Notice if you divide 236 in half, 112 is not quite half. So even there, they're kind of squeezing the numbers. Regardless, since the UK kind of bought heavily into Tranche 2, they didn't buy as many with Tranche 3. They agreed to purchase around 40, which would ultimately bring their number of Eurofighters up past 160, about 165, give or take. And this is pretty much where they were happy at this point. These were actually starting to have operational wings. Britain would have several, 4 or 5. By this time, Germany would have at least 2 full, and Italy and Spain would have 1 full and working on a second. And of course, various upgrades and, you know, flight tests and stuff were used, and these started to actually be deployed in combat, actually. This was one of the first. Around 2009, the 4 tornadoes that had been defending the Falklands Islands were relieved. They had been serving since the 80s by 4 new Typhoons. These would also be used by Britain in various missions in the Middle East, including 2011 over Libya. So yeah, they started to actually see combat. And that's where the FGR.4 kind of comes into play. Alrighty guys, hitting the home stretch finally. You wouldn't believe how much reading and video watching I've done for this plane. There's just so much out there. It is loved and hated. It really is the European F-35. One reason that Britain was so ready to go with the Tranche 2 and willing to pretty much buy the bulk of them was the ground attack close air support capability. The Eurofighter, while it initially started off as a fighter interceptor, very quickly, even in the 1980s, was envisioned as what the Europeans call a swing role, or Americans call a multi-role aircraft, meaning it can be configured. Think, F-16. The idea was this first started off as an air-to-air, and then later add the ground attack ability, which wasn't scheduled to appear for some time. Well, Britain pushed for this to be added sooner. The Tranche 1, the Block 1 and 5, the 5 would have a little bit of ground attack, but it really wasn't to the Tranche 2, which was started with the Block 8, went through 10, and ended up with 15 as its most advanced. We started to see a lot of this ability. The first FGR.4 was ready in the summer of 2008, and it was put into service to start replacing the aging Tornado GR.4, which itself replaced the older Jaguar GR.3. So Britain always wanted to have a ground attacker. Keep in mind the Harrier is still in service at this point, but it won't be for a lot longer. So this would be kind of the initial update, and a lot of the older Tranche 2s and even some of the Tranche 1s would be updated. The big push came around 2015 with Operation Centurion program, which was a push to Block 20, which was either an upgraded Tranche 2 or a new Tranche 3. This would have even wider support for air-to-ground missiles, like the Brimstone. It would also have brand new fiber optics, and it would introduce conformal fuel tanks, so more of a range and lift capability. Program would pretty much run through 2018. They would convert 107 older planes, at least total, including all the older ones, to full FGR.4 capability, able to essentially use the same ordnance as the Tornado GR.4, which allowed the Tornado to be retired this year, 2019, meaning that the Eurofighter is now Britain's prime ground attacker since the Harrier is out of service as well. They did leave about 24 F2s unconverted just to be dedicated interceptors carrying air-to-air missiles only. But yeah, the bulk of the fleet was converted over to FGR.4s because they can do all kinds of roles. And that's pretty much it. There have not been a ton of upgrades for the Eurofighter because of its protracted ability. They did start to be mounted and able to use anti-shipping ordnance, mainly missiles, a couple of years ago. Of course, the computers have been continually updated and all that good jazz. But really at this point, the nations are already kind of looking to the future, what to replace it with. Spain, Germany, and Italy are already working on another joint project, basically called the Next Generation Fighter. How imaginative. And Britain is kind of looking at what to do next as well, but who knows where it'll happen. So much money was spent on this, and they are in service now. Are they any good? Well, first, as always, the specs. We're about 52 feet long, with a wingspan of just under 36 feet, so quite small for a modern jet. As you see, it is a delta wing design. It does have canards in the front that are movable for flight. They even move on this model, which is pretty neat. Standard is a 27mm cannon with 150 rounds, although quite a few British planes don't have this activated. Some do, though. Has a total of 13 hard points, 4 under each wing, 5 under the fuselage. Carries missiles, bombs, rockets, like I said, up to 3 drop tanks. You know, the usual. What's actually quite impressive, they can carry up to 20,000 pounds. Not bad for a relatively lightweight fighter. It is powered by 2 engines. At altitude, it's rated to be Mach 2 capable. Even at sea level, it can get over the speed of sound, so past Mach 1. And like the F-35, this is also capable of supercruise, meaning it can go supersonic without afterburner. I think this can do about 1.5 past light speed. It's known for being very agile, nimble, maneuverable, especially the dedicated air-to-air fighter version. But even the ground attacker still is quite capable. And of course it can use modern pods like the Lantern or the Sniper, all kinds of, the usual gobbledygook that modern fighters have and cost a lot of money. They're cool hardware, but usually cost a ton of money. It also is semi-stealth, probably not quite as much as the F-35, certainly not as much as the F-22, but it does have a low radar cross-section, and some efforts were made to minimize its heat signature. So it does hit all the right points. It also doesn't need a horribly long runway to take off and land. And it has a very modern cockpit, as you would expect. It is a good fighter. But how long have we been at this video? And this is a very brief synopsis. It was already overdue by 54 months when it entered RAF service in 2003, and no one can even calculate how over budget this thing is. I think if the members weren't so contractually obligated and so deep in it already, it really became a too big to fail project, and a point of pride, to be fair. Another thing, as I said, each plane is assembled in its home nation, but parts like the wings, the fuselage, front, back, avionics are made in each country, so they're not made redundantly. This means that, let's say Spain makes a wing, they have to ship that to all the other nations. What if they're behind manufacturing, they have a natural disaster, whatever? It means all 4 nations are dependent on each other for manufacturing. And this has led to parts shortages, thus delivery delays, more than a few times. And of course, if it were ever a global war again, this could be a serious handicap. But I think each nation is just going to pretty much stick with the Typhoons, Eurofighters that it has. Who knows if Tranche 3B will even ever get made. As of this year, at least early on, when I made my notes, no one had really signed for it. So they pretty much did Tranche 1, 2, and 3A. To date, 565 of these have been built in total. There are some outstanding orders, about 60. Planes are still left to be built in current contracts. There have been a few export customers. But yeah, this is pretty much, even though it's used in several air forces, the RAF is probably what you would consider the primary operator. Certainly the one who was eager for the ground attack and reconnaissance version. Everyone else just seemed pretty okay with the defense fighter. Well, I hope I got more of the plane and camera. I mean, this video is long enough, surely just by dumb luck I did. But I figured if I was going to do a video, I might as well do it right and really give you the saga, the epic, if you will, gone with the wind of the gun world, the missile world, the plane world. It's a story. I still love the part about Spitfire too. The models themselves, of course, from Corgi are what you'd expect. Very heavy die-cast metal. Very little plastic on these. You see the tail, sometimes the tails on these. Tail might be metal or plastic, hard to tell one-handed. I think the canards are plastic. Yeah, they are. But yeah, the whole wing and all this, and it probably is more or less a whole piece. This one, the underbelly missiles come attached, but you can attach fuel tanks if you wish. You can also put the air brake up or down, and the landing gear up or down. The T.3 over here comes with a little more, which is kind of funny for a trainer. It comes with a total of 3 fuel tanks. It also comes with 2 missiles, 1 for each wing, because these were combat or are combat capable. The idea is if Britain ever needs them, they're available. Majority of their fleet are the single seaters, but they have got T2s and T3s still around. Of course, 2 seats. But yeah, neat models. I definitely like to have these in 1/72 scale versus the 1/200. The 1/200, they're just too tiny. It'll be interesting to see what Hobbymaster does, how theirs looks next year. But Corgi's had these out for a while, so I'll stick with what's known. Alrighty guys, I'm tired, you're tired. I think the Europeans were tired of this plane years before they even had them, but yeah. I really do appreciate you tuning in. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And also check out some of my other videos. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.